I know among chimpanzees, there are marked sex differences in play toy preference in juvenile chimps. So if you give a male juvenile something that approximates a doll, he's likely to tear it apart, whereas a female is likely to take even a block of wood and treat it as if it's an infant, let's say. And those, like chimpanzee juvenile males, prefer wheeled toys to infant-like toys, which is quite remarkable given that they don't really have any, now I'm wondering, if there's an association between that and hunting, for example, and also I'm curious about what you've made of the sex differences. We kind of hypothesized already that a perceptual landscape could be differentiated systematically, so you're looking for tools and obstacles, or it could be differentiated socially. I mean, obviously your relationships with people are another means to joint ends or individual ends. I mean, so you could imagine the world lays itself out to people as a place of things or as a place of social interactions. And it also sheds some light on maybe the hyperreactivity to novelty that is characteristic of the systematizer, because one of the potential pitfalls of paying attention to detail would be sensitivity to variation in detail. Whereas if your proclivity is to perceive higher up the abstraction chain, those differences are going to vanish in the generalization.
Yeah, but as soon as you move to the general, you're going to lose a lot of information.
Right, of course. But that's part of the advantage of moving to the general.
Yeah, so if I call them hypersystemizers, a hypersystemizer, which may characterize some or many autistic people, they care more about the particular system in front of them, to understand this particular system. So what would be an example? So let's say that the child is building a tower out of Lego bricks. Many autistic kids love Lego, and and they often focus for long periods. Sometimes it's called obsessions, but I think that's a kind of pejorative way of describing what they're doing. They're locked into the detail of how do all the bricks fit together and what they're trying to build. But they may not be looking at other children's faces in the room, or at adults who are trying to interact with them, because they're so focused on the system that they're trying to build. They're not trying to think of what are all the different possible systems I could build. They're just trying to build this particular system. Once they've done that, they may then, under their own control, make a change to the system. So it's not that they're averse to all change, but they want change to be under their control. And I guess what's challenging for autistic kids, or for a systemizer, a strong systemizer, is in the social world, in the playground, for example, you've got kids running around, you've got lots of people talking to you at once. There are, some of the verbal communication may not be literal, so you're trying to track the meaning of words when someone's using sarcasm or using metaphor or other kinds of figurative language. You've got not just focusing one-to-one. Like in our conversation, it's a little bit easier because it's one-to-one. But imagine if we were in the pub and there are 6 people talking at once, and you're trying to keep track of what does one person think about what someone else has just said, or what someone else is thinking. So it's these multiple levels of employing a theory of mind in real time and being expected to react with a socially appropriate response. All of that is too many moving parts. Whereas taking apart a transistor radio and putting it back together again, or taking apart, I'm going to use kind of a nice domestic example. Imagine a 3-year-old child who takes the toaster in the kitchen, takes it apart to understand what happens inside when I push the lever down and when the lever comes up and the toast pops out. that's a child who's going to be a future engineer, a future systemizer. And I think for a long time, because I've been working in the field of autism for 40 years, in the bad old days, we would have tried to discourage autistic kids and autistic people from their repetitive behavior, sometimes called obsessional behavior. We thought that was bad for them because they're never going to learn about the real world if all they do for hours and hours is take the toaster apart and put it back together again. But actually, that's their learning style for many autistic kids. And if we see that not as a bad thing, but as a good thing, that they take a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and they want to put it together again in a complete way to understand how every piece fits into the whole. You hear of these anecdotes of autistic kids who can do that, maybe not even using the picture on the sort of the right side of the jigsaw puzzle. They can do it face down. So they're using the shape and understanding how every shape locks in a unique way with every other shape. But they can do this very rapidly. So it's kind of, we should focus on the strengths of autistic people. And, that could then become their stepping stone into flourishing in education and flourishing in the place of work. But if we're expecting all kids to be hypersocial, checking each other's faces, checking each other's relationships and body language and reading between the lines, picking up hints, autistic kids may appear to be struggling. Whereas if we focus on their strengths, we can say, well, this kid's got a gift. Let's not worry about whether the child is making eye contact or not. Let's just let the child learn in their own way and see how far they can go. And, parents who recognize their child's autism as it's neurodivergence, that we don't have to expect all kids to learn the same way, to process information in the same way. Just let the kid follow what they're interested in. Those kids might decide, I want to do mathematics all day. And sure enough, they end up in university and they're on the fast track into advanced mathematics, even if along the way they haven't really managed to learn how to write an essay with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which communicates to a reader, because that's not their interest. Their interest is how numbers fit together, just like how pieces of the jigsaw fit together.
Let's talk about the relationship between this hyper focus on tool use and systemizing as opposed to functioning in the social world, and sex differences, and also the consequences of that in the education system. So, and I want to add another dimension too. Just before I stopped being a university professor, I was starting to take a look at the relationship between your scales, systemizing and empathizing, and the big five personality dimensions, because empathizing sounds an awful lot like agreeableness, right, at a trait level. And I'm wondering if I should know this, but I don't, if there's been some well-conducted research assessing the relationship between these interest patterns. I mean, there are studies of interest patterns as well. The Ryasek model, I can't remember who developed that. I mean, there is a taxonomy of interests, right, that's been quite well documented. But I was curious about it temperamentally. So let's talk about the sex differences, the implications of that in education, and then the temperamental issue.
Sure. So I should have really responded to your question about sex or gender differences earlier, but let's bite the bullet. We've found over many years, actually, that in the general population, that's to say the non-autistic population, there are these on average sex or gender differences, both in empathy and in systemizing. So what we find in small-scale studies is that girls and women, on average, score higher on tests of empathy and on measures of empathy. And boys and men, on average, score higher on tests of systemizing and measures of systemizing. I say small scale because back in the day, we would be testing a few hundred people. But now you can do online research. You can really do research at scale. So we published a study back in 2018, which was 600,000 people taking the empathy quotient, the EQ, and the systemizing quotient, the SQ. They did it online, so that's how we could achieve such large sample sizes. And we found, sure enough, replicating the smaller studies, that women on average score higher on the EQ and men on average score higher on the SQ.
How big a difference is it in standard deviation terms?
It's
approximately?
It's a great question. It's a significant difference. I'd need to look up the effect size, and I could, contact you after the conversation. But it's a significant difference, and especially when you have these large samples, they jump out at you. They were robust gender differences. We've also used a performance test of empathy called the eyes test. It's also called the reading the mind in the eyes test, where you look at photographs of people's eyes. And the test is whether you can infer what someone might be thinking or feeling just from looking at the emotional expression around the eyes. Because the eyes...
Right, so that's a gestalt.
It's a gestalt, yeah. I mean, it is. If you imagine like a letterbox, you've only got this much information, but it turns out to be very rich in information about another person's state of mind. And women, on average, score higher on it's called the reading the mind in the eyes test, compared to men. And just a few years ago, 2022, we published a study showing across 57 different countries, so this was kind of independent of culture, you see this female superiority on the test.
Are there tests that are that straightforward on the systemizing side that show the male advantage?
There are. I mean, one quite old one, which you may remember, is called the embedded figures test, where you have to find a target as quickly as you can that's embedded in a larger design. And men are faster and more accurate in finding the part within the whole. So that might be a systemizing test. We've just completed the development of another test, which is more about mechanical reasoning, asking people whether a lever will move up or down depending on the cogwheels that are moving in different directions. So you're having to it's kind of like looking inside an old-fashioned watch to understand the drivers, the cogwheels driving movements of levers. And males perform faster and more, higher. They score higher on average on that test. So these are controversial areas, as you know, because, the field of sex difference research or gender differences research understandably gets a lot of pushback. We all want a society where there's gender equality. But that's more about our social values. It's not necessarily a scientific question about whether male and female children and adults, whether their minds work in the same way on average. And I keep using those two words, on average, because the best we can do as scientists is compare groups of females and groups of males on these different measures and see if we find a difference.
In the temperament literature, the differences in agreeableness, which I think are most closely related to empathizing, they maximize in gender-neutral societies. They don't minimize, right? So in this is not controversial research from the technical perspective because it's been unbelievably well established. So you can rank order countries by the degree to which they've implemented sexual say, parity in the law and in society on sexual grounds. And then you can look at the differences in magnitude of temperament differences between men and women. And what you find is clearly the case that, well, for example, differences in agreeableness and neuroticism are maximized in the Scandinavian countries. So if you flatten out the environmental variation, you seem to maximize the genetic variation. And I'm curious with regards to empathizing and systemizing, if you rank ordered, if you did the same analysis, do you know if there's any evidence that?
It's a great question. I haven't seen any research on it. But first of all, going back to your question about is empathy closest to agreeableness if we think about the big 5 personality dimensions, that makes sense to me. And there may be some data out there that confirms a correlation. But agreeableness, I would say, and you're the personality psychologist here between the two of us. So you tell me, but agreeableness to me involves keeping track of how someone else is feeling and what they might be thinking. You and I are having a very polite conversation, so we're being very agreeable, probably because we don't want to insult each other. We don't want to hurt each other's feelings. So we're kind of exercising our agreeableness, but that is really what I was calling empathy earlier on. If you don't care about, the other person's feelings, you can be as rude as you like. Driving your point home in a debate, you could be very blunt. You could be very direct. You could be very, insulting. There's all kinds of, different ways that you could use language, which would not be agreeable, even if you're making a very logical point. So, I think I'd agree with you on that kind of overlap between these dimensions of individual differences.
Well, the most relevant element of that, I would say, is not so much the somewhat obvious point that agreeableness and empathizing might be associated. I would say what's more interesting from a scientific and social perspective is whether low agreeableness is associated with systemizing. Because one of the things that's peculiar about the personality and psychopathology research is that there's a tremendous number of positive trait names and identifiers on the empathizing side, on the agreeable side, but there's very little positive about the disagreeable side. And that's a big mistake because it's a normal distribution for a reason. And there's just as many reasons to be disagreeable as there are to be agreeable. The question is, this is a comic trope with regard to engineers because they tend to be somewhat parodied as blunt and disagreeable in their prioritization of systemizing over empathizing. Do you ever watch The Big Bang Theory?
Of course. Yeah.
Yes. Well, so I mean, all of the humor in The Big Bang Theory is systemizing over empathizing.
Yeah.
Pretty much. And
that character, what's the name of the main character in The Big Bang Theory?
The gangly physicist. Is it Stephen? Simon?
No, neither of those. It'll come back to both of us in a second. But some people wonder whether he's playing the role of an autistic person. Because he's fascinated by science and the world of systems and technology. But he may not be paying equal attention to other people's feelings in the room. We have this phrase, read the room. Autistic people and maybe, some engineers may be less focused on reading the room because they're focused on understanding the system and making sure it's working. Right now, you and I are surrounded by mechanics and engineers making sure that the cameras are working fine, the sound systems are working fine, and that's their job. That's their talent, and they may be kind of less, focused on are we both comfortable or are we communicating? Are we on the same topic? They're more kind of focusing on the engineering of our interaction or of the situation. But coming back to gender, just because I know that this is again a topic of mutual interest. The reason I say on average gender differences is you can find individuals who are atypical for their gender. When we do those big studies, you know, we've classified the population into people who lean more towards empathy than systemizing, or those who lean more towards systemizing than empathy. So those are two brain types. We call them type E and type S. And then there are people in the middle who are kind of equal in their empathy and their systemizing. We call them type B for balanced. And then there are people at the extremes, people who empathize non-stop, but may find systemizing challenging, and vice versa. People who systemize non-stop and may find empathy challenging. And in that big online study, we had 36,000 autistic people take part. And they tend to be in the type S profile. So leaning more towards systems than empathy, or even in the extreme type S, where there's a bigger discrepancy between their systemizing and their empathy. But back to gender, you know, you can find females. Well, maybe I should kind of back up a little bit. What we find is that more women than men are type E. It's about 40% of women and 20% of men. And more men are type S. Again, it's about 40% of males and 20% of females. But this is already kind of telling you that this isn't about gender. It's about, you know, because you can't prejudge an individual man or a woman just from their gender. It's about the type of brain that they have.